Our event today. Our next scene is an excerpt from Lisa's novel. You might have seen these postcards just around the corner up here for Rise of the Tiger. And if you come around the corner further, you'll see these three pieces of artwork, which are illustrations illustrating her novel. She spent the past 7 months slowly releasing her novel out onto the internet piece by piece. And with each piece that she released, there was a new piece of artwork to accompany it. So, she is here to share with us a portion of her novel, Rise of the Tiger.
Thank you. Well, as Troy said, my novel is Rise of the Tiger, and just so you have a little bit of sense going into the scene of context, the hero is a scientist who's also a king, and his city, which is very industrialized, which there's a little bit of steampunk going on in this fantasy, and this industrial city is basically on the brink of extinction because they are facing the loss of all their known energy sources. And so his goal is to try to find an endless energy source that's going to provide power for the city forever. But unfortunately, he's been thwarted over the course of the story by numerous of his enemies, and he has now been sentenced to fight for his life in the public arena. But unlike the Roman arenas, this particular arena doesn't have human combatants or animal opponents. It has machines. As Jude emerged from the tunnel, the light of the arena burnt his eyes. He halted in the doorway, blinking against the pane. The arena was the largest structure in Aurelia, situated in the lowest strata of the city, near the Great Gate. Its circular walls dominated the surrounding tenements, where the poorest Aurelians lived and died in squalor. So high were those walls that the city barely peeked over the mountainside behind them. Instead, the outer hull of the city loomed terrifyingly close, reflecting the green hue of the gaslight over the grim field below. And grim it was indeed. Blood mingled freely with the sand and gravel. Dust billowed over the field dotted with corpses, masking the spectators who packed the 3 tiers of seats above. As Jude stepped onto the gravel, a roar shook the arena. Gold-tipped canes pounded on a distant glass. Wine glasses knocked against armchairs, and bits of dry bread rained the sand around Jude, exploding into crumbs. Squaring his shoulders, he held his head high, his sword proudly poised as he strode across the field to the adjudicator's box. Protected by a shield of glass, this most ornate of boxes was decked with an indigo bunting, and atop it, like a crown jewel, the diamonds of Lord Haramel's waistcoat twinkled. If Jude focused on their sparkle, he could ignore the words now rising above the roar. Look at his armor. He's been through a war already. Have you ever seen King Jude in public? I thought he took after his father. Jude stared at those diamonds with all his might, but somehow his armor, such as it now was, began to weigh terribly. Sweat congealed inside, running down his muscles. In all this hateful crowd, did anyone stand on his side? Or was he merely a ringside freak? Surely Mother and Malchus were here, Bayard too, if only he could steal a glance. But 1,000 monocles were trained on his every move. Their lenses twinkled through the dust, refracting the spots of light with unbearable strength. Behind them, wine-flushed faces now chanted his name as an epithet, as fists, white-knuckled, boxed the air. Jude kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, but just as he reached the adjudicator's box, he tripped. The crowd hooted and stamped their feet. Regaining his balance, Jude glanced down. A human corpse lay at his boot, mangled, soaked in its own fetid blood. His stomach turned. And still, the crowd laughed. Jude stared at those boots, counting the spatters of blood, until at last Lord Caramel appeared at the edge of the bunting. A velvet cape framed his shoulders, medals dangled from his arms. All his watches had been concealed, but somehow, somewhere under all that finery, one pounded a warning beat just for Jude. The Lord raised his hand for silence. Gradually, a hush swept over the crowd. He lifted a horn-shaped amplifier to his lips, booming his voice across the arena. "Citizens of Aurelia, behold your champion!" The crowd overwhelmed him for a moment. "This day, your former king will fight 3 rounds against the wildest of our foes. If he wins them, he wins his life, and possibly his throne." A rumble rose around him. "Of course, that decision lies in your hands." The rumble swelled to a cheer. "Are you ready, good citizens?" Feet pounded the stands, and more crusts exploded against Jude's helm. The Lord's amplifier turned toward him, followed by a cold and taunting stare. Are you ready, son of Bryden? For the first time, Jude glanced up. Such stubborn, harsh people these Aurelians were. What the universe had taken from them, they had carved again from its refuse. A whole city with all its ingenuity, sustaining itself on the very cycle of death that had destroyed their world. Now, hurling toward an energy crisis, they faced death themselves, a death from which there would be no rebirth. No wonder they loved their arena. Among their red, contorted faces, none seemed either remotely familiar or even kind, yet somehow the sight of them dried Jude's fear as the wind dried the sweat against his skin. History had made his people thus. He would not change them, he could not. Instead, he would speak to them, he would cry out to them with the poetry of death. In the rhythm of combat, they would read their history and hear the promise of their future. If his legacy lay solely in this moment, then so be it. Raising his sword to the crowd, Jude plunged it toward the corpse at his feet. The flesh peeled back against the blade until it buried itself in the gravel.
Heavy stuff! To take us up a notch even further then, now we're getting...